In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Welcome to this livecast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as: each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 10th edition and the final version of the series The Future of Capitalism, a series initiated and designed by Moral Markets in collaboration with Pakhuis de Zwijger. And today, instead of asking 2 international thinkers to join us, we have decided, because this is the last one, to invite 4 European economists to join us to reflect on: can we actually create a European market economy? And of course, it's already there perhaps, but how can we improve them? And with them, we will talk about this possibility of a European market economy. And we will ask the question, what kind of market economy in Europe will enable societies to flourish? And how can economic policies be steered towards a more inclusive, just and sustainable economy? And moreover, is there a model thinkable which is a serious alternative compared to the US or China model and geopolitical dominance? And finally, perhaps we can even reflect on the question whether we can, despite the different cultures we have among the European Union, we can come to a unifying European economic system or model. Okay, and we will do that, as I already mentioned, with 4 speakers from our beautiful continent. And the first, and we're honored that he's part of our series, because he's not only a professor but also a politician. The first person I would like to introduce is Luis Garicano Gabilondo, and he is a Spanish economist and politician who is currently a member of the European Parliament from Spain, and he's also the Vice President of the Renew Europe and Vice President of the European political party, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. Before working in Brussels, he was a full professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and the London School of Economics. The second person we have invited today is Dalia Marin, and she's a professor of the international economics at the Technical University of Munich School of Management, and she's a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. She is also a senior research fellow at Bruegel in Brussels, a European think tank on economic policy in Europe, and a fellow of the European Economic Association. The third is actually from Belgium. He's Geert Noels, and he's the founder and CEO of the chief economist of Econopolis. He's a commentator on financial and economic matters, and after working for 15 years as a chief economist at a financial institution, he founded this initiative. He he won. He was awarded with Economic Shock, awarded the public prize at ABN AMRO for the best non-fiction book in 2000. Earlier in 2015, and his newest book is called Gigantism, and that is from 2019. The fourth speaker is Tito Bueri. He is an Italian economist and currently professor of economics at Bocconi University in Milan, and acts as the scientific direction of the Fondazione Rodolfo De Benedetti. He was the centennial professor at the London School of Economics, where he's currently the senior visiting professor. Okay, from 2015 to 2019, he was the professor of the Italian Social Security Administration, and he's now a scientific advisor of Foundation Rodolfo De Benedetti, where he also served as a scientific director. It's a lot of credentials, and it's only to introduce them and to show them we have a lot of knowledge at the table tonight. As we always do in this series, we kick off this session with a statement of a young economist. And for this, we go now to this person who's going to introduce the theme of tonight. Please welcome Jim Suri.
Good evening, everyone. What kind of market economy do we envision in the future of Europe? That's the central question stated in this final webinar. We can conclude that our current economic and financial system is no longer capable to solve today's global challenges. Namely, the dominant goal in today's economy is defined by profit maximization and economic growth. However, we may have to shift towards a society where well-being is central while restoring the balance of our natural world. As mentioned before, we need a fundamental paradigm shift to give a different answer to the question, how are we doing? In order to have a just and equal society, we have to redistribute wealth and make sure that we redesign the economic and financial system so that wealth and power accumulation can no longer occur in the absurd forms we have now. Crucial in this view is the difference between what people deserve and what they actually get. The last couple of months showed us that people we need the most in society are often underpaid and thereby undervalued. That's why we need to fundamentally revalue the public sector, not by only applauding, but by showing our appreciation via significantly increase of their income. We need a European society where not only shareholders, but every citizen can have a decent say in what's going to happen. This implies a different power balance between markets, the state, and society. For example, democratizing private firms via voting entities, which are formed by all stakeholders related to that company, can change the state of mind and lead to different actions others than maximizing profits while neglecting the social and ecological externalities. As for our tax system, I think it makes sense to shift the pressure from labor towards wealth. This will lead to fairer distribution of wealth, and furthermore, in order to end the ongoing tax avoidance by multinationals and individuals, we can harmonize our national tax systems, and simultaneously we can strengthen our European regulations in order to eliminate the tax havens on a worldwide scale. Another crucial part of our new European market economy is the financial system. The current negative dominant function related to our real economy has to transform in a positive and supportive function. This can be done via a couple of actions. First of all, via a European public payment and saving infrastructure, so that people have a safe way to use and stall their money. Secondly, a form of credit guidance by the government, so that new money flows to the places where it's actually needed. In other words, to productive and sustainable innovation, instead of what we're seeing now, buying existing financial assets or real estate. And lastly, diminish the amount of unproductive and even toxic financial innovations, such as derivatives, via regulation. To conclude, I think we have to realize that our European economy and our financial system are not a goal in itself, but a means to an end. In my view, this end is defined by human flourishing, where all basic needs of every citizen is fulfilled within the boundaries of our planet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes. And so let's start the group discussion. And of course, because this is the 10th edition, and we have already had a public research, actually, a discussion, 9 discussions with all kinds of economists from all over the world, we have deduced some elements which we would like to discuss with you. 3 topics. And my colleague David van Overbeek will introduce these topics, which are somehow a summary of what we've done. It's not a full summary, but it's the essential, our essential elements of the things we have to discuss with each other. But before we're going to go into these 3 elements, I thought, as an introduction, it would be nice to ask all 4 of you, to a short statement on what you think is the most essential topic we should discuss if you want to reimagine a sustainable, vital, fair market economy. What is the most important either value, institution or practice we have to discuss? And perhaps we can first go to Mr. Professor Garicano Gabilondo. Can you explain to us what would be your first most essential thing you want to talk about?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, my main concern would be not to throw the baby with the bathwater, like the Americans say, meaning we are going through a crisis after very prosperous decades that we had after World War II, with a very wide consensus, with societies united, with reforms. The Netherlands, for example, with the administrations in which Mr. Bolkestein was, and Koch and so on. And now the pendulum seems to go in the opposite direction. People are saying that instead of markets, we should go to state aid and state intervention and no competition, but facilitated monopolies. I think that nobody thinks that after this crisis, the state should have the right to limit a freedom of movement or indefinitely. This is an exceptional thing we're doing now. And similarly, I don't think we should take from this special moment the lesson that the state has to intervene all over the place. There are 2 problems, I think 2 and no more, that we need to tackle: climate change and increasing inequality. And we can do those 2 problems by working through the market, not by increasing arbitrariness, not by forgetting the lessons of the 60s and 70s. As we know, we defend the market not because it's just freedom, but because the market is the only way to harvest local knowledge and to make sure that innovation goes forward. People who know what is needed are the people who are on the front lines, not some bureaucrat in some ministry. We shouldn't just suddenly change our minds about that. Clear. So we have to harness the market to make changes, and that means, in my opinion, companies should maximize profits. Given the companies the objective of doing something else simply allows managers to give themselves a big salary and say, well, I didn't make a lot of money, but I was doing some other thing. I think we should, taxation of wealth, I do agree with that bit that was mentioned. I think that we should harness the market to fight climate change, and that's the emission trading scheme, a very successful scheme that we need to expand worldwide. And we should make sure that the welfare system works without many distortions. And that means not means-tested welfare that introduces all sorts of problems, but just a general safety net that benefits all citizens and that allows citizens to maintain their freedoms.
Clear. Thank you. Just an opening statement, but already enough topics to talk an entire evening about. Thank you so much. Let's go to Professor Marin.
Sorry.
Yeah, you can just talk.
No, I'm talking. I'm on. Yes. So my focus is on globalization. Because the crisis that we are experiencing now is actually also putting into question globalization. So what I mean by that is that the supply chains have been a distinct feature of globalization. International supply chains are ways of producing in different countries to lower costs, basically. So that is the distinct feature of globalization, because 100 years ago, we also had firms that moved into other countries to produce. But the new thing about globalization is that firms produce, the production process itself has been internationalized in order to exploit lower costs in other countries. And this era of globalization, which has been called hyperglobalization, which started with the fall of the Berlin Wall and ended in the financial crisis of 2008, this model of producing is under severe crisis, if you want so. So we have done some research which shows that this hyperglobalization ended because the financial crisis has made these international supply chains more costly. The reason why it made it more costly is because there was a rise in uncertainty after the financial crisis. And this substantial increase in uncertainty made these supply chains more fragile, because now firms must have expected that with a certain probability, the input that they expected would not be delivered. And that is costly for the firm. And at the same time, the financial crisis led to a dramatic drop in interest rates because central banks tried to fight the adverse effects of the crisis. So this fall in interest rates made the adoption of robots less costly because the financing dropped substantially. So what the firms did is, after the financial crisis, actually they reshored production from the low-wage countries back to the rich countries and invested in robots instead. Yeah. Now, with the pandemic, I think this is going to become even more stark, because if you have a shock like this, firms start to reevaluate the business model of producing in supply chains, and they will just reshore even more so. And I think so. There will be globalization in the future, but the era of hyperglobalization is ending,
Clear.
And has consequences which we should discuss.
Yes, and then of course go to experts on shocks, Geert Noels. Mr. Noels, what is, according to you, the most essential thing we should discuss if we want to talk about the future of capitalism, of a European market economy?
I think the most important is not to copy the United States or China, but really think about the strengths and the own characteristics of Europe.
Yeah.
And so what I see is too much discussion about we should find an answer to the size and the capitalism of the United States or China. And we become a bit like them. But I think we have to go back to the roots and treasure the fantastic diversity that we have in Europe, instead of trying to copy their model and think that all this diversity hampers us in our growth and development, which in my opinion is not the case.
Interesting. It reflects a lot of the discussions we actually had the past 2 months in this series. Thank you so much. Just as an introduction, let's go to Professor Bouhoueri. What is your answer to this notion of what is essential to discuss if we want to explore a European market economy?
I think at this stage we should discuss and plan on a smart retreat of a state, because in the last few months we really have been experiencing an invasion of a state in uncharted dimensions. It has been ruling over virtually all aspects of our lives. It has been deciding how many persons we can invite for dinner. It has decided how long we can stay out at night, whether when we walk in the street we need to wear a mask, and when it is time we can take it off if you run a bit more. And more important, it has been banning all type of layoffs, including individual layoffs. It has been intervening massively in firms, paying wages of workers being put on short-time work. It has been even deciding whether lifeguards on a beach can practice breath-to-breath, mouth. So, you know, there are things that clearly are unsustainable in the long term. This cannot be on for a long time. So we should really redefine the border of a state. And I think in defining the border of a state, we can highlight what are the specificity and what Europe can do, unlike Asia or the US. And this is mainly going back to our culture, which is an identity, which is being the land of redistribution. And I think there is also another dimension in addition to redistribution and fight against poverty and inequality, and this is health, because there are tremendous differences in life expectancy. And I think that now there is more awareness of the importance of the health sector. So these two fields are extremely important in redefining the role of the state: social protection and health policies.
Clear. Well, we would now like to discuss three transitions with you. And for that, we have prepared three propositions. And David van Overbeek, my co-host, will introduce these topics and try to find a group discussion with you. And just let's see if it's possible to just have an open dialogue between you four. I would also like to say that we have an audience which can also participate in posing questions. There is an editor on these questions, but if you have questions, please post them via Zoom. You can find that button on the program page of Pakhuis de Zwijger. Enter the Zoom environment and then you can use the Q&A button to post questions. Please do so, and we will receive the best ones here at our screens at the table, and we'll post them to our international guests. But for now, the floor is, I hand the floor to David van Overbeek, who's going to introduce the three propositions.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight with us. The first thematic thread that we have seen in the course of this series that we've been making is what I would call institutional transition. Over the course of the last weeks, many of our guests have advocated some form of democratization of large companies in order to outbalance a kind of narrow-minded focus on shareholder interests and profiteering. First off, for example, Luigi Zingales, he takes a laissez-faire approach to institutional transitions and tries to persuade managers and investors that it is in fact in their best interest to focus on maximizing shareholder welfare, not wealth. Isabella Ferreiras, on the other hand, she brought up the notion of bicameralism, by which a large firm's power will be divided among both the capital and labor investors in order for workers to get more influence in a firm's decision-making. And lastly, Colin Mayer has proposed yet another different approach, being disappointed by the discrepancy between the agreement reached at the Business Roundtable in 2019 and the behavior of large firms during the corona crisis. He thinks firms should in some way judicially be held accountable for their purpose or social mission statements. And these remarks and this thematic thread has led us to the following proposition, which I'd like to ask you, all four of you, to respond to. And first off, so the first proposition of tonight is Europe must impose reforms to make it possible to hold firms judicially accountable for their social mission statement or their purpose. Could I ask Mr. Gabilondo, Professor Gabilondo, to respond to that first?
Luis Garicano, the Spanish have two family names. So
sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So no, strongly no. Very strongly no. I think that, in my opinion, I think that what Luigi Zincades was pointing out, which is to try to encourage firms, to try to tell firms or to help them, to push them in the direction of certain actions is perfectly fine. To make the judiciary accountable for something as vague and as difficult to measure, like their social purpose, is, I think, counterproductive, because it will increase uncertainty. It will increase the ability to play games by directors. Contrary to what the statement seems to think, a CEO who has a very simple way to be evaluated, which is he maximizing profits, is he seeking good opportunities, etc., is more accountable than one where we say, well, you should do the good for society. I mean, he starts spending money in things that he likes, like making, better buildings and spending money in luxurious buildings for his company. And then he can say, well, I was being green, et cetera, et cetera. You can't really measure that. So I think it would be a huge step forward, and I would oppose that.
Okay, thank you.
A huge step backwards, I meant to say, sorry.
A step backwards, all right. Well, let's move on to that in just a few more moments. First off, Professor Marin, what is your response?
I believe that we do need some institutional change. If I look at Germany, what happened in Germany after the fall of communism is that firms in Germany threatened to go to Eastern Europe and produce there in their wage bargaining with firms. So if you want, globalization, the opening up of Eastern Europe, led to a change in the institution of wage bargaining, and made unions much less powerful than they used to be. And that led in Germany to the so-called wage restraint. So wages really were increasing much less in Germany than in other countries. That, in fact, had an enormous efficiency push to Germany. So the German economy became much more efficient because on the one hand, wages didn't increase as much as in other countries. So Germany gained competitiveness. But on the other hand, it also meant that firms went to produce in Eastern Europe, and thereby lowering their cost because wages there were much less. So the German economy became very efficient, but in some sense at the expense of the workers. And I would even go much further. I would say that the fall of communism led also to the decline of the era of social democracy. That's what the era until the Berlin Wall, we had an era of social democracy. So that means that parties in power were mostly social democratic and introduced the welfare state and so on.
Yes.
So after the fall of the communism, many of these leftist parties introduced market principles and gave away the idea of social protection, or as much social protection as it used to be. And I think that was a mistake. And part of the reason why people are so much against globalization is because they feel they haven't been gaining as much as other groups in society. They didn't gain a part of the pie. And the reason is, in my opinion, that it has something to do with the loss of power of unions. So when you look at research, we actually observe this, because we observe in all of the rich countries, including the United States, that the labor share in income, this is the income of the part of GDP that goes to workers. So the labor share in income has been declining from the mid-80s to now substantially. And so there was a debate among economists, what's the reason for this? And there is one candidate explanation is there is an increase in market power.
Yeah.
And the other explanation is that there is a loss in union power. And probably both of them have some validity. But I think that if you think about how the future will look like, I think that labor unions need to have more of a say on the table than they had in the past.
Okay.
And maybe I add something. Part of the reason why I believe so is that if you observe that globalization is in retreat and firms invest now more in robots, then it is important that the labor the unions take an active role in the direction of artificial intelligence that is going to happen in the future. Because in the past, there was a very strong focus on automation, replacing workers by robots. And I think we want to have a union that is in favor of technical change and supporting it, but at the same time, to try to shape the direction of a technical change of artificial intelligence that is taking place.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the next speaker. Mr. Noels, what is your response? Should Europe impose reforms to make it possible to hold firms judicially accountable for their social mission statement or their purpose? You have to unmute yourself, Mr. Noels. Thank you.
Yeah, I see. I think there's an elephant in the room. This question, apparently from your introduction, comes from an observation that European companies are too much concerned about their shareholders. And that doesn't seem the case to me, because if I look to the statistics, and they are at my right-hand side, over the last 15 years, so starting in 2006, before the financial crisis, until today, European companies have something like 20% loss of profits. Now, you may change the starting point, but even after the financial crisis, it's a bit like that. So the problem in Europe is that the model that we have installed, even before the financial crisis, doesn't deliver profits. Now, this being said, so there is a problem about capitalism, about general profitability of companies across Europe. And there might be exceptions. So there might be companies in Germany or in the Netherlands or in Belgium that make good profits, but they are rather the exception than the general trend.
Yes.
This being said, if I may add 10 seconds, I think purpose is something very important. And I think there is even a case to be made that purpose could increase the profitability of companies. But what you propose so legal enforcement of purpose is something that even in a utopian society is something very difficult, because how will you judge the rightfulness of a purpose? And so I would like to stress the elephant in the room, because you want to talk about capitalism, but don't quote me or don't pull me in a debate as if European companies are making too much profits, because in general today they don't.
Thank you. That's a very good remark. Mr. Professor Boeri, what's your response to the proposition?
My answer is in an example. I don't know how many of you know the case of Parmalat. It was an Italian firm located in Parma. Many of you may know it because it was owning a soccer team that actually won also a European league once upon a time. Well, Parmalat was universally acknowledged as being a socially responsible firm. Was involving workers apparently in all major decisions, and was providing all type of support, childcare benefits and other type of services to their workers. At some point it turned out it had been cooking the books, and the firm went bankrupt, ruining and destroying an entire community. So I really don't think that looking and holding responsibility firms for taking this type of stand is a productive way of. Firms should do well the job they should do, which is generally to maximize the value of a firm for the shareholders. We can encourage them to somewhat be more responsible by, for instance, having some kind of tax deduction for well-designed welfare schemes done in the firm. But providing social protection is not the business of a firm. It is the business of a state. Right. And that should be done very well. What we should be worried about is that firms pay taxes. They don't elude taxation and they don't evade, above all, taxation. There are giants of the web that are not paying taxes nowadays, and we should make sure, and Europe can do something in this respect.
Yeah.
Professor Boeri, you're a fan of Parma?
Not really, but no.
I went to the final because
I'm not a supporter of Parma, but I liked Parma once.
I went to the final.
You went?
Yes, yes. It was against my club, Antwerp, so a local club. And there was a Belgian who was the captain of Parma, that's Georges Grun, who is very well known in the Netherlands because he eliminated the Netherlands to qualify for the World Championship. For the funny interruption of this evening.
Thank you for reminding us. Thank you so much. Yes. The Netherlands and football is a complex relations at the moment. Let's go to the second statement. Thank you so much. Let's go to the second.
So first of all, thank you all. I think a clear no from all of you, except Professor Marin. She mentions that labor force is something that we should focus on, and especially a very good remark from Professor Mr. Noels as well about how many firms have actually been profitable in Europe over the last years. So thank you very much for your first response to this proposition. Let's move on to the second one, everybody. So this is about another important thematic threat, which concerns uneven accumulation and distribution of wealth. Some of you have already mentioned that in your introductory statements. So François Bourguignon, he argues that although globalization has caused inequality between countries to diminish, inequality within countries has risen to new heights, even in Europe. Professor Josh Ryan Collins points towards a combination of Western policy decision and overall financialization of housing markets. Instead of being a necessity in order for humans to live and flourish, over the years, housing has become a more speculative activity in which many partake, especially the already well-off. And lastly, Joseph Stiglitz, who was here with us, he argues that wealth disparities are self-perpetuating and that it is produced by the vast amount of political power the wealthy hold to control legislative and regulatory activity. Although his analysis focuses primarily on the United States, he warns for the potentially devastating effects huge wealth disparities can have on Europe as well. This brings us to the second proposition of tonight. In order to curb further wealth disparities, Europe must implement rigorous wealth tax reforms. Professor Boeri, let's start with you for now. What is your response to that?
I think that, no doubt, inequality is a major issue and one that should be taken very seriously. And in Europe, we have some experience in this respect. I don't think that the solution is to really very much related to housing. That has been perhaps the beginning of the financial crisis. You know, there was this idea, the American dream of providing social housing and allowing people to get to be able to access capital markets to buy a house. And that has been, what has been bringing to the crisis, to the financial crisis. So I don't think that's really the key thing. What we should do is to design better welfare system. We have a lot of experience in this respect. We can do extremely well. We can certainly do better than Asia and way better than the US in this respect. I'm not sure. I understand what Luis Garicano was saying before about the fact that means-tested benefits are somewhat distortionary. I agree with that, but there are ways to reduce the distortionary effect of a means-tested benefit. By means-tested means that you give money to those who are really needy and they have lower incomes and low also asset condition in the family. I'm not so sure that the universal basic income would work. Universal basic income could work in developing nations where we have little information about individuals and families and allocation of wealth and so on and so forth. So I really really would redesign the welfare system. And as I said also at the outset, I think another very important dimension, and one that we are learning very much about it under the current juncture, is health system. Health is no less important than income in providing support to family, because we have huge differences in life expectancy across socioeconomic groups. And on that respect, we should do more, because we have been doing very little, and there are too many different health systems in Europe. There is scope also for integrating health system in Europe, because where we coordinated better, we would have faced the pandemic in a much better and efficient way. It's not possible that if one country is in a difficult situation, the other countries are not cooperating and helping out. There should be more cooperation across Europe in providing health support.
So more cooperation across Europe to provide support. Professor Garicano Gabilondo, what is your response to this, and what is your response to what Professor Boeria said as well?
Well, the first on your statement, I would think that this is correct, that we should shift to the extent possible taxes in the direction of wealth, and particularly, as you were pointing out from one of your previous panelists, towards housing, which seems to be a place where a lot of the distortions have taken place in the past. On Mr. Boris, on Tito Boris' point about means testing and basic income, I do agree that you can do means tested, and I mean I'm exaggerating when I say we should do something totally not means tested. What I fear is that we are seeing a proliferation of different little schemes with housing. School and electricity entitlements, etc., that have the result overall of putting a huge tax on labor, basically. What we see in Europe is that working, basically, in many of our countries doesn't pay. It's better to be, when you are receiving a lot of these benefits and when you have huge social security taxation on people who work, the result is that it's better not to work, or it pays very little to start working.
Yes.
My view then would be that we need to try to remove all those distortions. I mean, I moderate a bit in agreement with Tito. I moderate a bit my saying about non-means testing, but basically reducing that interventionist kind of the state trying to get into the life of each person to see whether they need this and that and this and the other benefit, and trying to have something a little bit more broad that allows us to help those who need it.
Thank you. So not have the state involved in every part of everybody's life. Thank you. Mr. Noels, what is your response? And perhaps could you also tie that into your first opening remarks, in which you mentioned something about the roots of Europe and the uniqueness of the European economy?
If the question is, do we need more wealth taxes? The answer is, it depends in which country. And there was another, I think, indication that you found real estate too much untaxed. I think also that depends on the country. And the remarks from the other colleagues here in the panel discussion, that it doesn't pay to work. It also depends in which country. And sometimes I have the impression that we see inequality and wealth creation and extraordinary wealth creation around the globe, which is very much concentrated in the US, and that we want to do something about it in Europe. But the problem in Europe is wealth creation. And we should rethink how we can do that, because I think the remarks are always coming up also. The state is very much involved. Yeah. And on the other hand, you want the state to do even more. Now, this is a paradox. So let's have a debate on what the state should do. And as this is a discussion about Europe, let's start the discussion. What should the European government, let's say Brussels, do, and what shouldn't they do anymore? And related to that, because more and more political power is shifting to the central banks. If you talk about wealth creation and some unequal wealth creation, it's a consequence of central bank policy. Yep. And especially in real estate. So also there, I think the political responsibility of what's happening with central bank policy should be discussed extensively.
Thank you. So let's first move to Professor Marin on her first response, and maybe also tie that into, I think, Mr. Noels' very good remark in what's the role of Europe to play in this?
I want to disagree with Geert Noels, because the data show that profits have increased over time in the last 2 decades. And this is not only true for the US, this is true in all the European countries. So the profitability has increased, not declined. So this is what the data show. The second thing is that I think that wealth inequality has a price. For instance, when you look at Germany, the wealth inequality in Germany is among the largest in all countries. And yes, I'm sorry, I can't give you the picture, but I have the picture too, you know. Maybe we measure it in a different way. But anyway, the wealth distribution in Germany is among the most unequal in all the European countries. And there is a price you pay for wealth inequalities, because Germany, I was actually shocked when I saw this, but Germany is one of the countries with the least mobile social mobility. So, the price is the more unequal the more unequal the society is.
Yes.
The lower is the social mobility. So, what's your probability from getting from a poor person to the top 10%, and this probability is lowest in Germany, and that's quite worrying, I think.
Well, let's move first back to Mr. Noels. What is your response to that?
I think there is more in Europe than Germany, and I agree that some things in Germany have been derailing. You mentioned the unions, and you mentioned also some of the low wages, and that's probably true. But I thought the discussion was on Europe as a whole, where there is a lot of diversity, and I'm looking at the figures of Europe as a whole. For instance, in terms of profitability, and trying to get a grip on what we should do with European policy, and what German politicians should do is a different discussion.
Mr. Professor Boeri,
Germany is one country in Europe.
Yes.
Germany is one country in Europe. So the experience matters that Germany has, no?
Yes. But then we should change the discussion and talk about the German economy, which is an interesting subject, obviously, but that's a different debate. I think it's an important one, but I thought we would discuss European capitalism.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so let's stick to that subject, but I leave the word to the moderator.
Yes. Well, let's move to Professor Boeri. What should Europe do in this regard? What are the possibilities for Europe? You mentioned a couple of things already.
Well, I think Europe has been developing its own capacity to borrow and in capital markets, and programs like the Recovery Fund that I think is more should be called Next Generation EU, because it should in principle look at the prospect of young people in Europe, and most of the attention should be done in defining the program should be done in that respect. I think it has to develop also its fiscal capacity, and being able to raise taxes and get revenues on its own, because otherwise this type of capacity will not last long. And And as I was already saying before, I think the key ingredient of this should be one of intervening on the giants of the web, on these multinational firms that are operating cross-border. And unless there is really coordination across Europe in this effort to tax collection, I don't think individual countries going alone would do much in this respect. So that, I think, is something that should be done. And in terms of what to do with this money, I think I said already before, I think the key feature of the European identity are one, being the land of redistribution, the land that has been fighting poverty more effectively than many other parts of the world. And also, I think it should be more. One that provides better access to health systems and try to prevent large differences in life expectancy, because these are those that really determine the fact that there is unequal opportunities and there is not the social mobility Martin was talking about. Dalia Marin was talking about. Marin was talking about before.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so we have to move on to the third proposition. Time is flying, as they say. So let's move on to the last thematic thread that we've unveiled in this entire series, which is the green transition. So all of our speakers in one way or another have argued the necessity to limit economic activities that threaten to destroy our livelihood and our habitat on Earth. For example, Julia Steinberger advocates a degrowth strategy. She takes a self-proclaimed radical stance and thinks that it's impossible to curtail damaging economic activity enough within a for-profit capitalist logic. The current system, she says, favors and produces consumption, and every added unit of consumption is irreconcilable with the necessity for less growth. And Pettifor, on the other hand, praises the European Green Deal. Governments should take the lead in the green transition, since we cannot rely on firms to take measure in their own hands within the necessary time frame. She advocates a green growth strategy. And lastly, Jeffrey Sachs, he takes yet another approach. He analyzes the challenges of achieving economic growth while protecting the environment and achieving an equitable distribution of resources. And he favors an approach along the lines of SDGs, the Social Sustainable Development Goals, which he co-developed, obviously, which is also a green growth strategy. Now, this brings us to the third and final proposition, which I'd like to pose you all. Europe must implement reforms that stimulates consumers and businesses towards degrowth. Professor Garicano Gabilondo, let's start with you. What do you think of this proposition?
No.
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 All right.
Strongly no. Let me say why. So I think there are two strands in the environmental movement, among the green movement. One is the, let's say, Greta Thunberg strand that wants us to all have our own apple tree and eat our own apples by our garden in our house, and that's it. And there's another strand that says growth is necessary and we need to all kind of make sure that that growth is greener. The first thing I want to say is that I think the first view is incompatible with our current system. I think that everything from pensions to debt to social security to it requires a certain amount of growth to be sustainable. But also notice that contrary to what one of the persons that you mentioned that supported this, I don't remember who it was, a woman who supported the degrowth strategy, the first speaker that you mentioned.
Yes.
Consumption, she said, well, every unit of consumption damages the planet. Notice that that is not really the case, because consumption is increasingly massless. We are now consuming, viewers who are watching this are consuming video. There is no atoms involved, no CO2 has been used. My kids are playing on their phone computer games. The presents that I do them for Christmas don't have mass. I give them a present which is a video game that they download and that they play. Another present can be music, which is on Spotify. We don't make LPs, we don't make books, we don't make, most of the things we're not making anymore. All right. I would say if you wanted to weight GDP, to weight in a scale, the GDP today versus the GDP 110, 50 years ago, I wouldn't be surprised if it's lighter. because a lot of the GDP we produce, certainly per dollar, it's lighter, that's for sure. Think about Facebook, the big companies that have grown, Facebook, Google. I mean, they don't produce anything. They produce electrons. And electrons don't really pollute the environment. Okay, there is some energy that is used, but it's minimal. The energy to produce a Kindle book and download it compared to the energy to produce an old-fashioned thick book, all the trees that go into paper, etc.
Clear, yes.
So the second point is consumption does not necessarily mean we kill the environment. And I think there is something much easier than this degrowth strategy, which is a system that we have in Europe that we have to substantially improve, which is the emission trading scheme. We have a scheme that says we have a certain amount of carbon that is allowed. People pay for this carbon. They can trade. So the one that has a lower cost of reducing the carbon consumption does the investment. And we, between all of us, we decrease little by little in Europe how much carbon is produced until we get to zero by 2050 or 2040, or maybe even earlier, who knows, if we decide to tighten the standards Europe-wide.
Yes.
So we need to expand this to the rest of the world. Happily, China, the biggest news this year that was covered by COVID has been that China has joined this effort, and China was our biggest worry. China is going to introduce an ETS to have a hugely ambitious global warming target, CO2 reduction target. And my view is that these two things are going to be compatible. We're going to invest a lot, and that's going to produce growth into the Green Deal, into reducing pollution, and we have to go in that direction. If we tell our citizens, we want you to stop going on holiday because we want to degrow, and we want you to stop buying stuff because you want to degrow, we will have the gilets jaunes. I mean, the proposition like in France, the proposition you put on the table, in my view, would be politically and economically unsustainable.
Unsustainable, yes. Thank you. Professor Marin, what is your response to that?
I think that there is no conflict between green and growth. The contrary, I think that's the beauty of the capitalist system, that once you have this aim of getting a green economy, there will be firms innovating in green technology and making growth and green go together. One example for this is, look at the race for a vaccine now against the pandemic. There was a race, and look at this. Very quickly, firms came up with a solution to fight the pandemic. So that's here I believe in the market, absolutely, that the market will make sure that if we want to have a greener economy, the market will have the end, and you give the state to provide an incentive for firms to innovate in green technology. So the state has a role here, actually. And yes, so they don't. There are no conflicts.
Yeah, no conflict. State has the rule. Professor Boeri, what do you think of that?
I think that depicting environmental policy as a sort of luxury good and suggesting that we need to reduce growth rates to allow for a better environment is a recipe to give power to the populist across the world, because it would mean making the poor even poorer, and creating a conflict that can absolutely be avoided, as also been said before. I think we are coming out of this pandemic with a better knowledge by people of the notion of externality. The layperson has realized that they are somewhat affected by behavior of other people, because if they meet someone on the street, they can be contagious by COVID-19, and by the same terms, they can be by the same token, they are now more aware, I think, of the external effect of their action and with effect on the environment. So I think we should build on this awareness and devise environmental policies properly measuring the cost and benefit of these policies. Often these things are not being seriously taken into account. For instance, the effect of environmental policies on health is not properly measured, and And clearly health has a major implication for the well-being of individuals and also for the fiscal costs themselves. So I think, and also where policies have been taking place, they also have been really involving way less, even strictly financial costs than those that were envisaged before. So I think really we have to create and build up on this awareness of externalities and do more for the environment without reducing growth. It is possible to reconcile the two things. And indeed, after the financial crisis, a lot of investment has been taking place on green economy, and I think we will have a benefit also in the long term from this investment, and more perhaps will take place with the Next Generation EU fund.
Yeah. Okay. So, Mr. Noels, what do you think of that? And what do you think of do you have any thoughts on the European New Green Deal?
I think I can join most of what he said of the previous speakers, and those who suggest degrowth, I think they probably don't know what growth is. It's mostly also a human ambition to solve problems and to improve its situation. So if you put forward the degrowth agenda, you create a lot of frustration and a lot of human beings that cannot develop themselves anymore and can't solve problems like COVID anymore. There are two conditions, of course, and they can be summed up with sustainability or leaving a good situation for the next generation, both in terms of climate impact, but also in terms of financial impact. And we should be careful about the first, of course, but also about the second, and that's also related to debt. Now, the Green New Deal is, on the one hand, a very clear statement that Europe wants to go forward and be a leader, a worldwide leader in the climate challenge, and sees it as a competitive edge. I think, on the other hand, typical European error of doing it top-down, thinking that you know the solutions already, limiting a lot of entrepreneurial effort and innovation and, let's say, surprises of where the solutions might come. And so going forward with an agenda in which lobbies and big companies always have an advantage. And so I applaud the ambition. I think it's a missed opportunity to think that Europe top-down from Brussels, trickle down to the bottom, can decide what good climate activities are and underestimates what an entrepreneurial climate they could have created instead.
Yes.
So I'm more in favor of what has suggested by the previous speakers, also by setting certain, let's say, a framework like the ETS framework, which could be a very good way of incentivizing companies.
Yes. Professor Garicano Gabilondo, you've mentioned in your opening statement you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Do you believe the European Green Deal, just like Mr. Noels said, is too much top-down, possibly, and doesn't make the full use of the entrepreneurial potential in Europe?
It remains to be seen. I understand his concern, and I think it's well taken. I think there is a risk that there are no impact assessments and things are taken in too dirigist manner. But I think we're still on time to make sure that those investments are smart. I think the absence of the UK from the European Union is a bad news for the ideological balance of the Union. We have a clear move towards a system that has much more dependence on centralized solution, as Geert Noels said. And we know, I mean, why do we live in capitalism? Apart from freedom, we believe that local knowledge is the base, that people know what Geert is calling the entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, people know what they want when they go to the shop and they decide that they don't want coffee because coffee is too expensive.
Yeah.
We don't have to decide who doesn't buy coffee when there is a freeze in Brazil. People who don't like coffee as much switch to tea, and people who are depending on coffee stay on coffee.
Yes.
And we need to use those kinds of mechanisms for greening. And the best mechanism we have is the ETS. Let me just tell you, like, I'm working. I wrote the opinion for the economics committee of the European Parliament, and I'm working on something called the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically tries to expand the ETS, but making sure that people outside the union have to pay. Countries outside the union have to pay for the carbon that they used if they didn't pay in their home country. That's the kind of smart policy that expands this ETS and that makes sure that everybody has at the end to make those efforts to green the environment.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, our 50 minutes of this proposition are already over, and we have to move over to the final part of tonight.
Yes. Yeah, and of course, it always feels a bit strange. I mean, we can talk about every sentence all of you spoke. We could talk about that for an hour or even longer. So the final question would, if you would propose a institutional reform or a new institutional approach or something in the European Union, because of course Mr. Noels said we are talking about Europe, right, not of individual countries. What would that proposition be? Would we have as already is mentioned, would we have a fiscal strategy and different fiscal policies, and what would we tax, or would it be something else? What would you suggest as an institutional reform to create that European market economy, which is more solving more problems than it is solving today? You already, of course, mentioned that we should not throw away the child with the bathwater, so that we also should be proud of what we have created already here. Let me first go to Mr. Noels, who was quite expressive already in that he wants to propose some changes in the institutional framework of the European Union, right, to create a different market economy.
Well, yes, I think that Europe should learn also from its mistakes, but also learn from where it started. And it started with a very sound vision, I think, about subsidiarity. And that's something that Europe should always keep in mind when going forward. So also, from time to time, decentralized. There are a lot of things that can be better managed on a more local level. Where the general level is concerned, I think we are in a dangerous situation in which the European Central Bank is becoming a kind of, let's say, non-democratic institution that believes strongly in a planned economy. And I think there the balance should be better, and that more political debate should be done about the real mandate of the European Central Bank before we stabilize the whole system.
That is a clear suggestion what we should discuss about. Let's go to Professor Marin. What is your proposition for an institutional reforming the institutions of the EU?
I think Europe needs to face the artificial intelligence revolution. I think this is something, I mean, the Chinese are dealing with it by pushing it very much so by the state, by state capitalism. And I think that Europe needs to think about this in the future, because if you don't want to have social polarization worsening in the future, dealing with how the future of artificial intelligence goes is something that needs to be taken care of. And I already said that what is important is to get incentives with firms, incentives by firms to go into new jobs with artificial intelligence rather than to replace only old jobs. So to face the opportunity that this technology is giving us to create something new rather than to replace something old.
Yes.
So I think this is a major point. I dare to disagree about the ECB as a central planner. I don't think that this is that this is a good description of the central bank.
Yeah, it's clear that we should host a debate between the two of you. Let us go to Professor Garicano Gabilondo.
I have no doubt, and it's one that comes also in the first statement by my colleague Tito Boeri. And I know it's a harder one to say in the Netherlands. Corporations in Europe are not paying taxes. This is big corporations. Let me just give you an example. Netflix 2 years ago paid total taxes in Spain of 2,000 euros. Any little bookstore in Madrid, any little kiosk in the Ramblas paid more. In Barcelona, paid more taxes than Netflix paid in Spain. This is true for Netflix, it's true for Apple, it's true for Google, it's true for many, many other companies. Yeah. It's not only internet companies, it's also true for Nike or for Starbucks, who had all the beans that they were selling in the UK, produced in a hugely coffee-producing country, yes, which is Luxembourg and Switzerland. I mean, these are the places where coffee gets grown in Europe. Everybody knows that because of their tropical climates. So not, of course. So we have a real problem there of equity, of distribution, of resources for our welfare states. And we open up the capital mobility before solving this. And I would encourage you to drop some of those most crazy kind of statements and think of this question, which I know it's more controversial in the Netherlands, but it's extremely important for the future of Europe, in my opinion.
Clear. Now, you also know that we host actually the band U2 in the Netherlands. You know that.
The what? Sorry, there?
The band U2.
Exactly, because
that's a Dutch band, you know that.
Yes, of course, exactly.
Thank you for that. And let's go to the last speaker, Professor Boeri. What is your suggestion for institutional reform in the EU?
Well, I don't think there is a single institution that could do the job. I think the most important thing is that we should, protect and support our kind of democratic capitalism, because, the type of capitalism that are present across the world are different. If you look at Asia, clearly this is a political capitalism without allowing for much democracy. I think the democratic system are better to also handle the type of things that we should do, redistribution, especially if they are supported by appropriate checks and balances that allow minorities to have a voice. Otherwise, clearly, the type of redistribution which is needed would not really go to people who are really needy and need to have a type of support. So in that sense, I think I'm fully supportive of the fight that the European Parliament is making now, is having with some countries in Europe, in new accession countries, in terms of the fundamental rights. That's really something extremely important. I think we can also be more effective in dealing with externalities, where sometimes systems that are less democratic can be better in some principle to deal with externalities. But insofar as we get more coordinated at the European level, insofar as we improve democracy at the European level, we democratize Europe, we can also handle externalities in a better way than done elsewhere in Europe, in the world.
Thank you so much. Let's go for the final thoughts of this evening. Back to the young economist, Jim Suri. What are your final thoughts on this conversation?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much to all the invitees. It was a very fruitful discussion indeed. So I segmented my reflections in 3 topics. First of all, I want to talk about some general remarks. So I really like the quote made by someone who said that we don't have to copy the United States of China. So I think we have to centralize the power, so to say, of citizens instead of centralize the power of the market or centralize the power of the state. And as a concrete example, you can look to data sovereignty. So in America, you have the market who owns the data, in China, the state, whereas here in Europe, we can have the ability to give the people the power back of their own data. I think that's important. I also like the idea of that the working force in Europe needs more voting power. So that's a way of power distribution. The second remark I wanted to make is about wealth distribution. So a lot has been said about taxation. I think it's a good idea to shift away from labor towards wealth and profits by all firms. So also from Netflix in Spain to pay their fair share. And in this, we have to find a better way for our welfare system in order to fulfill all needs of citizens. So we have no poverty left. Everyone can get a house, for example. Everyone can get good health care and good education. And in my opinion, we have to organize a system around those values as a core issue. And the last point was related to ecology. So the question if we needed degrowth or green growth. But for me, the most important thing is that we centralize nature again in our society. So we see a tremendous loss in biodiversity, a decline in soil, air, water. And I think if we centralize that to restore it, then we can design an economy around it. And we can also have forms of economic growth which do not harm these natural values.
Clear. Thank you so much for that, for those remarks. Thank you, our international guests, for joining us in this very short and very dense discussion. Thank you to the viewers for watching and for all your ideas and also the questions. Evelien Verhagen, dank je wel. Thank you so much for asking all these questions every all 10 editions. And then this was it. And the only thing I would like to, and thank you, David, of course, for joining us to doing this project together. The only thing I have to say is, if you want to be part of the next stage of this project, we have a message for you after this show, a short video on that. But thank you for now.
Thank you.
In our project, Rethinking the Future of Capitalism is achieved by presenting visionary economists and discussing capitalism in 10 online dialogues, and writing an important report on the future of capitalism in Europe. We invite you to participate in this exciting and vitally important project. How? If you have a great idea on the role of government, business or civil society, you can write a viewpoint. If you are working in academia or a business, you can spread this movie within your network. Next, you can also subscribe on our website to continue receiving information about our project. Last but not least, if you are a student or young researcher, you can make a very real contribution by participating in our essay contest. We invite you to send in your ideas on the future of capitalism. Write an essay about the role of government, business or the local community and win one of our prizes. Want to know more? Go to www.moralmarkets.org/future-market-consultation for more information about this exciting project. Let's get in touch.